Right, I think we are recording now, so welcome everyone. This is the second part of the resource conservation workshop.
Working.
Today we're going to be talking about cover crops and crop rotation with Christine Newton from the NRCS. So I just wanted to highlight why this is a resource conservation workshop series. The reason for that is I want to give everyone enough tools to start implementing some of the conservation practices into their fields, whether you're growing vegetables or if you have pasture. I hope that I can give you enough tools so that you can start thinking about these things. We all know that it's a lot easier to start preserving our natural resources rather than try and fix some of the mistakes that we've done in the past. So I wanted to highlight some of the conservation practices so that we can prevent deterioration of our natural resources. And another reason why this is a resource conservation workshop series is because I wanted to highlight some of the efforts from NRCS to create some of the conservation practices. And if you are not familiar with the NRCS, NRCS stands for Natural Resource Conservation Service, and they go back to the Dust Bowl times, and they came out as a way to help some of the farmers to implement some conservation practices to stop the deterioration that was happening back then. Nowadays, the NRCLs helps private landowners to care and make healthy choices for their land, to preserve soils, water, airs, and plant and animal resources. And they do that through one-on-one personalized advice that's tailored to each producer. Um, they work voluntarily with farmers and producers to help them create conservation plans that can cover many basic parts of preserving their natural resources. They also offer financial assistance programs that help pay some of the implementation of those conservation practices. So if you haven't seen their website, you can find them on the link here, and you're gonna have this recording later so you can go to their website. But you can find your local service center and reach out to them to get the help that you need. So similar to CSU Extension, they can do a site visit for you and help you see what are those resource concerns in your area and help you come up with a plan. And then help you get enrolled with some financial assistance programs. So they work similar to Extension in the sense that they also have, um, oops, they also have site visits. So they're just a very useful tool if you are needing some extra help implementing some of those conservation practices. And here are just a couple resources. If you're watching in your computer, you can scan the codes here to see the NRCS website and also the CDA STAR and STAR Plus program. And so for that, I'm going to have Lisa Nguyen talk a little bit about the work from the CDA. Lisa, are you
Awesome.
ready? Okay.
Yes. Thanks so much, Carla, for introducing me. Let me share my screen really quickly. So yes, hi everyone. My name's Lisa Nguyen. I'm the Eastern Soil Health Coordinator for CDA. So Colorado Department of Agriculture has a relatively new soil health program that we are currently taking producers to enroll in. And so everyone that's here today, I assume, has expressed interest in the topic of cover crop and crop rotations. And that's something that our program would like to help offset the cost for you for. In addition to those practices, we're really open to any practice that really is geared towards soil health principles, whether that's minimizing soil disturbance or diversifying the species grown on your field. We really want to work with producers that are open to trying something new for their soil health. And if you prefer to read, then we have, some basic overview of different things that we offer to producers here. So we have financial and technical support. We are partnering with CSU to help administer this program. So a lot of CSU Extension folks are helping us with the technical support. We offer up to $5,000 a year in matching funds to help farmers offset the cost of implementing a new soil health program. We offered 2 free soil tests in year 1 and year 3 of the program, as well as a soil moisture monitoring system that gets installed on the field that you enroll. So overall, this program is really meant to be sort of like a experimental type program for producers, something where we can take some of the risk out in trying out a new soil health practice for you, while also trying our best to give you the support that you need, whether that be in terms of finances or in terms of like technical support in what kind of soil health practice you want to try. Yeah, I'm going to put my email in the chat. So if you're interested or you want to hear more about this program, I don't want to take up too much of today's seminar with my spiel, but I will put my email in the chat box. So if you are interested or you want to just learn more about it, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. So we're gonna go ahead and get started with the next part. Now, Christine's gonna present about cover crops and crop rotations. And if you have any questions that come up to your mind, just type them in the chat box and we can read them at the end, or at the end, feel free to unmute yourself and ask whatever questions you have. Christine, are you ready?
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yeah, I can see your presentation.
Okay, awesome. Well, hello everybody. It's really good to see you, to meet you virtually, Lisa. I'm looking forward to working with you. And I have the opportunity to sit right next to Carla. So 2 very good resources for everybody listening to this seminar. My name's Christine Newton. I'm the conservation agronomist for the state in Colorado for the U.S. Department of Agriculture Natural Resources Conservation Service, also a certified crop advisor for the state. And I kind of provide support to our various field offices that are out there. They're scattered all across the state. We have a couple different positions that also mirror Carla's to work specifically with small acreage producers and landowners. Most of my work deals with more on the production side, so more large scale, but I'm really trying to get myself more familiar with some of the smaller operations and the problems and the unique systems that you guys work in. So I'm going to turn off my camera for the presentation, but what I'm going to talk about today is how we can use cover crops and crop rotations to build soil health. There we go. And the objectives of my talk today is to identify the principles of soil health. Lisa already kind of went through them, but anybody who manages land or who is in production agriculture, it's really good if we can help try to memorize these principles, because they truly should be the guiding principles that help us make our management system. So the more we can go over them and commit them to memory and help them be the principles that guide our decisions is going to make your soil ecosystem more productive. I'm going to take it one step further and talk about what it means to manage your land using a soil health management system. So these are unique to your operation, but really the goal is to try to meet those principles of soil health through various practices. So everybody's soil health management system might look a little bit different. And then I'm going to talk about what Carla actually asked me to talk about, which is 2 really powerful practices that can help you address the soil health principles: cover crops and crop rotations. I'm going to close kind of close the conversation with talking about how soil health management systems can help build resiliency in our systems for whatever might be thrown at us. And then just briefly talk about how NRCS might be able to assist with the implementation of a soil health management system. So here are, again, are the principles of soil health. You might notice something when Lisa presented on hers, there were 5. In a lot of the graphics, you might see that there are only 4. And that's because in some cases, I think NRCS chose to put incorporating livestock into the maximizing biodiversity principle. So when we talk about maximizing biodiversity, we're talking about above ground, below ground, plants and animals. So that's why this graphic only has 4, but we're not leaving out the livestock because it's a very important part of building soil health. So we've got maximizing biodiversity, maximizing the soil cover that's out there, and making sure that it's a diverse soil cover. Maximizing living roots, which can go hand in hand with soil cover. But when we talk about soil cover, we're also talking about residue or mulch. So it might not necessarily be living roots. And then minimizing disturbance where you can. And for the principles, again, I said I work more in large scale conventional systems. But it doesn't matter. The principles are really the foundation. And it doesn't really matter what type of agricultural operation you're in. Big production annual row cropping system, small veggie operations, pasture management, the principles really do remain the same. And by implementing the principles of soil health, you're going to increase that soil function and you're going to build a system that can work on feeding and protecting that soil ecosystem. So what is a soil health management system? I mentioned on the last slide that the principles remain the same. Those 4 or 5 principles, however you want to break them down, they're always there. They're what guiding which practices you want to select to be part of your management system. So those soil health management systems or your plan on how you're going to implement these principles might look really different if you're in a small veggie operation versus a row cropping system. They might even look really different between 2 row cropping systems. So the next step is to kind of adopt a suite of practices that work for you. Practices and techniques that you can implement to address as many of those techniques as possible. And then this is going to be your soil health management system. And your management systems and your plans should really be dynamic. I really liked that Lisa said that, try things out, experiment, figure out what works for you, and then adapt that plan, learn from it, change, and then, continue to update your soil health management system to achieve your goals and objectives. So the 2 practices that I'm going to key in on today are great for being part of your soil health management system if it's applicable to the operation that you have. You can see that I have the 4 soil health principles like on the table in the column on the far left, and then a bunch of different practices or techniques scattered across the top. This is not meant to be all inclusive. These are just some really, really common ones I work with when we're working with producers. And you can see, depending on what the practice is, which, scattered across the top, we've got perennial plantings, cover crops, crop rotations. If implemented strategically, you can address multiple soil health principles with these practices. And so you can see why it's important to address a suite of practices to implement a soil health management system, because really there's no silver bullet with anything. We've got to just look at how different practices work together to improve that soil ecosystem. And so I'm really going to get into some details on the 2 practices mentioned here and what I was asked to talk about today, but just know that a lot of these other practices are just as important and can really help make your soil health management system build resiliency and capacity kind of the more you adopt. Okay, so the first one I'm going to talk about is cover crops. So just basic definition, what is a cover crop? NRCS defines a cover crop in our conservation practice standard as a grass, legume, and or forb planted for seasonal vegetative cover. Most times we're working in annual systems, so annual cropping systems. We have a rotation where we plant a cash crop, harvest a cash crop, and then sometimes there's these areas in our crop rotation where there's nothing there, whether that's a fallowed time or whether we're just waiting for the ideal time to plant the next cash crop. You identify these windows of opportunities to plant a cover crop to ensure that there's always cover on the ground, there's a living root in that system. And so depending on your environment and where cover crops fit into that system, you're going to make decisions on which species work best. For folks who are working in pastured situations, it's not something that we have a practice for currently, but I've heard of people seeding annuals into their pasture ground. So in that case, you're not really identifying a window where there's nothing there. You might just be planting annual species in your perennial system to increase forage supply or diversity there. So I'm really going to be focused on how cover crops fit into an annual cropping system. Pictured here in the background, you can see this is really cool. This is from the northeastern part of the state in and around Holyoke. This is an organic producer who is experimenting with twin row corn, and then he planted it at a wider spacing than is typical, and then interseeded a cowpea cover crop, which is a legume, to try to fix nitrogen. So to try to help not only with managing the weeds that might come up in a wider row spacing, but also try to cycle nutrients because he is in an organic system. So he doesn't have the ability to use pesticides or synthetic fertilizers. So I just thought that was a cool picture, kind of showing how cover crops might work in this particular system. So normally if I was in a room full of people, I'd ask us to try to shout out what some of the benefits of cover crops might be. But I guess I'll just go through it. But if anybody wants to type in the chat, I can't see it anyway, of what some benefits of cover cropping might be, feel free to go ahead. You might hit on something that I didn't think of. We typically try to address these benefits of cover crops when we're working with a producer. So remember when I said certain practices, when implemented, they really have the ability, if you do it strategically, to address as many soil health principles as possible. Well, if you're planting a multi-species cover crop, you have the ability to increase diversity of that system. Even if it's a single species, if it's different from what your cash crops are, you're increasing diversity in time. So you can increase diversity in space and time by, diversifying your rotation with a cover crop, but then also planting a diverse cover crop, which is good for all things, habitat included. Lots of cover crops. Remember I said that we're usually focused on areas of crop rotation where maybe there's some bare ground or fallowed. Cover crops certainly help address that soil health principle of increasing cover. So you can help use cover crops to armor the soil surface, especially if you know that there's a critical wind period or event that maybe happens in the spring. And if you don't typically plant your cash crop to when there's cover out there, you can utilize a cover crop to do that, to make sure your soil surface is armored. Probably the most important thing that cover crops can help do is to help build stable soil aggregates. When you plant additional biomass in your system by using diverse species and cover crops, you have a living root in that system. You have more biomass, so you're increasing residue that's out there. That helps increase soil organic matter. You have roots that are in the system, so that's helping with soil infiltration. It's improving the water cycle. If you have a variety of roots, or maybe you have some legumes out there, the more diversity you have, the more living roots you have in that system, that helps build that soil biology. And what the biology does for us is it produces this glue, which is known as glomulates in the soil. and it sticks to the roots and it helps that soil aggregate together. And so why tillage is so destructive in these systems is that you break down those soil stable aggregates that are out there. So having a living root in the system, having a diversity of species out there, just helps maintain those soil aggregates. So cover crops can help with pest pressure. You can, just physically, that's why the producer in Holyoke was using those species in row, because they can be a physical barrier to pests. But you can also plant species that might be great for beneficial insects. And if you're reducing chemical inputs that could harm those beneficial insects, then that's kind of a twofold way to help keep those species populations, alive and thriving so that they can predate on pests that might be harming your crops that you're looking to grow and produce. Next, I kind of already hit on it, but cover crops can help build or improve soil organic matter. That's through producing biomass, keeping cover out there. And then when that biomass turns into residue, the soil microorganisms out there are going to mineralize and decompose that residue, which helps with nutrient cycling and efficiency. To kind of bump up that nutrient cycling and efficiency, you can include legumes in your cover crop mix, which help, harvest atmospheric nitrogen. And then when you terminate those leguminous species, it helps with having nitrogen in that system once they're dead. They can help with air quality. I think that's in there just because it's covering the soil, and you've seen the wind blow. The suspended particulates that are in the air just aren't good for anyone, the dust. So having your soils covered out there is going to make them less susceptible to suspension. Cover crops can help with winter wildlife, food and shelter. A lot of times, we're not growing our cash crops in the winter, but can we grow something so that there's something out there that could maybe trap snow or provide habitat for certain species that might be able to utilize it? In livestock integration, sometimes in Colorado, just because we're so arid, there's some studies out of CSU that really show sometimes the only way it's economically feasible to plant cover crops into dryland systems is to get that added revenue stream of being able to integrate livestock into that system. So, if you plant a cover crop mix that's great for forage production, you can graze that cover crop. And so that's just added forage that you might not have had. And then you get that benefit of, addressing one of the soil health principles of integrating livestock into that system. So some of the considerations, cover crops, just like any conservation seeding, is important. There's a lot of stuff that we need to do before we just throw seed out in the ground. I don't want to complicate it too much, but the more that we can think about before we implement the practices, the more successful it's going to be. And that goes with even if you're just experimenting with a practice, the more you can kind of think about and consider, probably the more successful it's going to be, just like anything. So what are your goals? What are you trying to achieve by planting a cover crop? If your goal is forage production for livestock, your seed mix or your timing or the way you manage your cover crop might look a lot different than if you're just planting a cover crop for weed protection. Your species for weed protection, you might want to pick species that come up right away and close canopy. And so you want to know what your goals are. There is some site preparation, just like with any seeding. You have to make sure that you have that good seed to soil contact. If you've got a lot of residue out there, you might need to manage that residue in some way. If you're trying to seed a cover crop into an established pasture, you might need to drill it in there. You don't have access to a drill, you're going to have to do something to be able to get that seed down to the soil. How much moisture is available for your mix? Are the weeds adequately controlled before you plant your cover crop? In some systems, you have to be cognizant of any herbicide carryover that could be left over from the previous cash crop. You don't want to plant species that could be susceptible to that. Timing of your species, just make sure they have an adequate growing season, because you want your cover crop to establish and produce as much biomass as possible, because that's going to probably address whatever goals you have. Yeah, understand the crop rotation and the functional groups. This becomes really important when you're thinking of your mix and the timing. If you're planting a cover crop, after you harvest your wheat, does it make sense to plant a cool season or warm season, dominant mix? Just make sure you're picking the right species for the timing of when you're going to seed. If you're planting legumes, just make sure they're properly inoculated. Usually seed companies are pretty good about that, but remember, inoculant is alive, so don't leave your seed in the sun. Make sure you take care of it like it's that seed is already living, essentially. For our diverse mixes, it can get tricky when you're seeding, because if you have really small fluffy seeds that only need to go, 1/4 of an inch into the ground, versus a pea or something that should really be going down into about an inch. Just make sure you're not seeding the tiny fluffy ones too deep or the big ones too shallow. So just be cognizant of that. A lot of our drills have separate boxes you can bag. You might be able to broadcast the really tiny seeds versus drill in the larger seeds. Just regardless, make sure that you're paying attention to that, because if you plant the tiny ones too deep, they're not going to come up. And if you plant the ones that need to go a little bit deeper too shallow, they'll kind of sprout up and then die. So really important. Yeah, moisture management. We're in an arid environment. If you don't have irrigation to help you out, it's risky. And then know how you're going to terminate your cover crop before you plant it. That kind of goes into just having the full plan laid out there, because the last thing you really want is for your cover crop to become a weed itself. And there are some species that we might recommend that could potentially be an issue. As NRCS folks are working with producers, we typically try to think about that stuff. We're probably not going to recommend that you plant cereal rye in a wheat system, just because that can kind of become its own weed. So just be cognizant of how you're going to terminate it. Make sure the timing is right. You typically don't want your cover crop to go to seed. I already talked about herbicide carryover. I kind of already talked about the economics of the cover crops too, but consider how the cover crop could affect the yield of your cash crop. This is something we have to talk to our dryland producers a lot. I mentioned before, in dryland cover cropping systems, in order to make it economically feasible, sometimes you have to incorporate livestock to get that added revenue stream, because studies have shown that if you're new to cover cropping, sometimes your next cash crop will show a yield decline. However, if you look at the whole farm economics, you consider reduced inputs, like maybe you're not needing to use as much pesticide or fertilizer. Maybe there's some reduced fuel because you're not having to till the weeds as frequently because you have a cover crop, kind of creating a physical barrier. When you consider like the whole farm economics, planting cover crops and incorporating them into your system, in spite of that yield decline, usually come out on top. Okay, so we've talked a lot already about some of this, but it's especially important in cover crops to ensure we're meeting the objectives of you guys. What are your goals? What are your objectives? We're ready to start thinking about the species we're going to be recommending or that you might be interested in planting. Now, what are some of the important characteristics of those species that we need to kind of key in on? The growth cycle, do we want to recommend a perennial, biennial, annual? How does that fit into your current rotation? Like I said, typically with NRCS, we're focused on annual cover crops. What's the growth habit? Do we want, an erect, single-stemmed species? Do we want kind of a vine that's creeping along the ground? This is really important when it comes to the type of equipment you might have available. Sometimes those viney species get caught up in people's headers and they just kind of become a nightmare. So just know the growth habit. The root architecture, again, the above ground biomass, just as critical as the below ground biomass. So this can be really great because there's several different rooting architectures. There's species that produce, like a long taproot. There's fibrous species, rhizomatous species. How deep do the rooting depths go? If we have an identified layer of compaction at 8 inches, let's make sure we pick a species that the taproot can go lower than 8 inches, so we can try to sort of vegetatively disturb that compaction layer that's been identified out there. We also use rooting depths to kind of pair it with our soil tests. So we have people do soil testing to look for nitrates a lot of time in the soil. And as you know, nitrogen, the way it moves in soils is vertically. And so it tends to leach down into the soil profile. This is really important in irrigated systems. But if we have nitrogen leaching past the traditional depth of our cash crop, can we plant cover crops to sort of scavenge those residual nitrates down at that level in the soil profile to where they can kind of scavenge them. And then when you kill your cover crop, essentially, you can cycle those nutrients back through the system. Fibrous root systems are excellent for increasing aggregate stability and improving infiltration. So kind of important to have a mix of species for that reason too. The rate of growth, can we plant species in a mix where we have ones we know that are going to establish quickly to get immediate cover right after we harvest a low residue crop like sugar beets or dry beans, that's really low fragile residue. Once you harvest that, there's not much left out in that field. So it might be important for us to pick some species that get in there and get cover immediately. What's the chemical composition of our cover crops? This is really important sometimes if you're planning on grazing, because sometimes certain species can, have nitrates or prussic acid and whatnot. So being cognizant of any allelopathy, I can't really say that word that well. But anyway, there are some species that might produce chemicals that might affect your next crop. So certainly that's noteworthy to mention, as well as some species like cereal rye will like mobilize nitrogen right away just because it's a beast. It comes up there and establishes a ton of biomass and then ties up the nitrogen for a little while before microorganisms have the ability to break it down. What's its stress tolerance? Oftentimes when we're planting cover crops, it's a time we weren't traditionally growing cash crops because maybe it's not an ideal time of the season. So you might need to pick species that can handle early frost or low moisture. Maybe not species that need a ton of fertility because unfortunately people don't fertilize cash or cover crops, which I get, I totally understand. But yeah, maybe species that don't need a bunch of fertility too. Time to flowering is really important because again, we don't want our species to go to seed. If we're planting a cover crop for pollinators though, maybe we do want some of our species to flower. So just something, depending on your comfort level, monitoring those species. Pest resistance or susceptibility, don't include species that are known hosts to other crops in your rotation. Just focus on diversity and incorporating a variety of plant functional groups. If you're just starting out, maybe a species mix with 3 to 5 species is better than, like, we have producers out there doing like cocktail mixes, they call them, where there's like, upwards of 17 to 25 species in their mix. Okay, so once we start identifying which plant characteristics are going to help us achieve our objectives and how they're going to fit into our rotation, we can start designing our mix. Hopefully mixes change and adapt as you get comfortable. You figure out what worked in your field and what didn't, and then you kind of adapt your mix based off of what you see out there. Maybe you really liked a certain species that came up and one you just didn't see enough of. I personally love flax. It's a beautiful purple flower that you can plant and include in your cover crop mix. But yeah, not going to get into a whole bunch of details, but I do want to mention that there is just a tremendous amount of resources available, and that you need to do your homework if you're going to be planting cover crops. This is one of my favorite resources to use. It's a publication that the Agricultural Resources Research Service came up with. You can see it's just a table of 64 different cover crop species grouped into these 6 major categories. And so when I talked about functional groups, that's cool season, warm season, cool season grasses, warm season grasses, cool season broadleaf, warm season broadleaf. If you can get a mix of functional groups, that's better to think about than just getting a mix of species. 5 grass species in your cover crop mix is not as good as 2 grass species and, maybe 1 warm season legume like sun hemp or whatnot. So tremendous amount of resources. The types of mixes you can pick are really going to be endless. I do have to say this ARS publication is not specific to this general area. So just know that some of these species are definitely not appropriate for even being planted in Colorado. Like I'm pretty sure chicory's on the noxious weed list. So yeah, don't plant chicory, but do your homework. Because in Colorado, some of these species are never going to be planted. They just might not work in our hardiness zones. But it is a good resource just to look at how things are broken down. You can look at the relative water use of certain species, the plant architecture, the growth cycle, and what functional group they're in. And then when you click on, like say you click on the oats little box, it hot links you to like a whole slide on oats, and it tells you, what seed rate, when to plant, what it's good for. So really good piece of literature. Before I move on to conservation crop rotation, I was just gonna show you a picture if you are a backyard gardener, or even if you just have your own backyard garden. I tried for the first time to plant a cover crop in my little raised bed. I don't have much to say for it, except that I planted it. This was the mix I used because in that part of my garden, the water always tended to pond up. I couldn't really get anything to grow there because it was just like concrete when I tried to plant my like little road veggies in there. And then the water would pond there and just kind of flood them out. But anyway, I planted this cover crop there last fall in October, and obviously at a way too high of a seeding rate because I wasn't really paying attention to that. But anyway, it's still growing out there. The triticale and the hairy vetch overwintered. They were winter varieties, but they're still growing out there. Of course, they're covered in a bunch of snow now. But as of last week, they were still growing. So it is applicable. I just wanted to show that it can still be applicable to our own operations. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next practice, which is conservation crop rotation. The way NRCS defines conservation crop rotation is a planned sequence of crops grown on the same ground over a period of time. We refer to it a lot of times as the rotation cycle. And so when we think about crop rotations, just think of like this timeline and how you might, rotate your crops. Rotations can include perennials where there's going to be the same species in place for a number of years. But, eventually for when we talk about crop rotations, something's going to be rotated out. So, a common rotation in this area that might include a perennial would be grow alfalfa for 5 or 6 years, then rotate it out with a couple of years of small grains or something before you go back into alfalfa. So I'm going to go through some of the benefits and strategies of crop rotations, just like I did with cover crops. Again, with the crop diversity, think of crop diversity more on a temporal scale now. So how can we diversify and get as far away from a monoculture as possible? We don't want to grow continuous crops. We want to change what's going to be on that footprint yearly. Crop rotations, when you think about it temporally, We gotta continue to keep that soil surface covered. And so implementing cover crops into your crop rotation, that's going to help do that. Maybe making sure in your crop rotation, you're following a high residue crop with a low residue crop. Say you're growing dry beans, which is a low residue crop. Maybe you want to follow it up with something like a small grain that tends to have a little bit higher residue that sticks around. You don't want to grow sugar beets or dry beans like back to back because that's too low residue crops. Crop rotations are huge with reducing plant pest pressure. Anybody who does any veggie gardening, you don't plant certain crops in the same place year after year, because what can happen is that soil can just kind of host certain pests or fungal diseases or whatever in the soil that could really make your next plant susceptible. So you want to rotate which species you plant, and that's the same in large scale production agriculture. You typically don't want to follow the same crops. Crop rotations can help build or improve soil organic matter, just like cover crops can. That goes back to the low residue, high residue, keeping the soil covered. That's all going to help you build and then and protect the soil organic matter that you have out there. Crop rotations also include how you till. What's the frequency of tillage? What type of tillage are you doing? Certain crops, it's tougher to go no-till. So that's an important part of it. Cover crops can help you cycle nutrients as well. Maybe you're going to, the example before where I said people might grow 5-6 years of alfalfa. That's a legume. So you're going low on the synthetic fertilizer, and you have that legume fixing atmospheric nitrogen for you. Then when you terminate that alfalfa stand to plant a small grain, you likely aren't even going to have to fertilize that first year of the small grain, because you're going to have a good amount of nitrogen that's available for your next crop. You might need to put some phosphorus down, but you can use cover crops to balance out your carbon to nitrogen ratios. What I mean when I say that is, if you think about anybody who's composting could probably teach this better than me, but different plants have different carbon to nitrogen ratios. Really high carbon to nitrogen ratio, like plant would be like grasses. They tend to have a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio than, say, a broadleaf, like a turnip or a radish. And if you think about it, all that means is like, how fast does it break down? So rotating species to balance out that carbon to nitrogen ratio of your system is important too. You typically want to, be in a ballpark of like 25-1 when you talk about ideal carbon to nitrogen, to keep those residues cycling and keeping those soil microbes fed. Provide food and cover for habitat. We talked about that. That goes with just keeping cover out there as much as you can. That's going to help with any sort of habitat that might be using your fields or nesting. Providing feed and forage for domestic livestock, same deal. Yeah. So what are some of the considerations for crop rotations? This is specific to NRCS. To meet our conservation crop rotation practice standard, you need to include a minimum of two crops. That makes sense in my mind, but wouldn't believe how many people want wheat fallow to count as a crop rotation. But yeah, we need a minimum of 2 crops that you're rotating on the ground. Ideally, you'll have, 4 or more, and maybe a cover crop thrown in there too. Try to maximize diversity. So plant broadleafs, plant, grasses, grains. And then your cover crop can really help with maximizing diversity of your rotation. So yeah, including cover crops within your crop rotation is awesome. The timing and the species that you pick, make sure there's adequate time. It's really hard in our environment to fall seed a cover crop for species that you harvest late in the fall, just because we do not have a lot of time before our first frost. So you can get creative. Some people interseed that cover crop into a growing crop, which helps give adequate time. And then you just have to kind of be picky about the species that you plant, making sure that they're tolerant of cooler conditions. Mix those functional groups. We already talked about that. But just like with cover crops, as many functional groups as you can get in there, plan that within your rotation too. And then consider those critical erosion periods. Here in the spring, April, May, probably March, April, it gets windy. So make sure that you have cover out there during our critical wind periods. And anybody in the NRCS office, or you can look at this data easily for yourself to figure out when the wind really blows here. Same with water. When do we typically get our monsoonal rains? Let's make sure that we have cover out there. That one's usually addressed just because we're trying to grow something whenever we have moisture. What's our seeding method? So we can make sure we have that seed to soil contact, broadcast versus drilling. Drilling is typically always preferable because it's just more successful. But if you don't have the ability to drill it, then broadcasting's fine. You just probably want to increase your seed rates and maybe see if you can incorporate that seed somehow. And then be flexible, be adaptive, consider crops or varieties based on our local climate patterns, figure out what's working out there for you, what's not, tweak your plant or harvest dates to maximize biomass or cover if you can. Consider strip cropping if that's something that works for you. You can see pictured over there. It's just a random Google Earth photo I screenshotted of people who are strip cropping. Basically, they're rotating what types of crops are grown in their field. And sometimes they're incorporating a fallow period in there, which, fallowing a strip of land is a lot better than fallowing the whole piece in terms of just cover, living root. So that helps you minimize fallow years. And then as always, this is a slide for our planners, but we just kind of always consider what your goals are and make sure that, we're recommending things that ultimately will always meet your goals and objectives. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up by talking again about how implementing these soil health management systems made up of these suites of practices that address the soil health principles, how they can build resilience and how they can reduce risk factors outside of our control, like extreme precip events, droughts. I love this ball and basin graphic. I went to school for ecology, and so it's really meant to be for natural ecosystems. But in my job, I've really gotten a joy out of thinking of our agricultural systems like agro ecosystems. Even though there's lots of inputs and there's lots of stuff that we do, anywhere we can mimic nature, I feel like, and treat these more like agro ecosystems, I think the better. But anyway, ultimately, this graphic just sort of shows the ball and basin. The idea is that the basin represents the ecosystem and the ball is sort of the state of that ecosystem. And the peaks represent some sort of threshold or ecological tipping point that when that ball goes up and over, it's going to transition into something different, something you might not want. So you can see that the ecosystems with the higher resilience or capacity to adapt to changes is much more stable. It's going to take a lot for that ball to come up and out of that basin and transition into a different state, one that you might not want. And you can see that's kind of depicted in that photo above. This is a system where the producer wanted to plant their pivot corners to this really diverse mix. Instead of just having it as bare ground, they wanted something that would benefit pollinators, something that would have perennial cover year round. And so you can see that system. Imagine if a rain event came in that system. Probably wouldn't cause a problem like the problem you see in the lower photo, which sort of shows you that there's a very low resistant or low resilience ecosystem. There's no cover out there. There's no living root. It's on a slope. And you can see just a single rain event, how vulnerable that system is to erosion. There's sheet erosion, real erosion. There's even some concentrated flow. You're losing incredibly valuable topsoil and any nutrients that you might have had in that soil. And so by implementing the top picture, I'd say they're pretty close to doing a soil health management system. They're pretty much meeting all of those soil health principles. And then the photo below, but just by looking at it, I'd guess they're not really meeting any of them. And so by implementing that soil health management system, meeting those soil health principles, you can really reduce the vulnerability to things that are out of our control. So using a systems approach and addressing the soil health principles, we know now is going to make our operations more resilient. In addition to these physical practices we talked about, like cover cropping, crop rotation, reducing tillage that I think Kat talked about a couple weeks ago. Soil health management systems can also include an increased data collection and record keeping. So practices that will allow us to make like even more informed and strategic decisions. And with this type of management, all this data that we're collecting, we're going to become more observational, and we're not going to have to be as reactive. So we're going to look at our soil indicators like aggregation, species diversity, and cover. And we're looking for telltale signs that, maybe our system could be healthier. Like if there's any runoff occurring, that's an indicator that there's something going on. We need to address a practice to stop runoff. If we're having fertility issues, annual soil testing is going to help out huge with that, and it will help us establish a trend, how we're doing. Plant tissue testing, the same, typically is going to help us with the health and vigor of our plants, whether or not we need to try to figure out our fertility a little bit better. What's our weather climate data? All of that stuff is out there. And those numbers, they're going to show you. Pictured up there is just a wind energy output climate data from Conejos County. So the NRCS, we have these models that'll just say, hey, when's the wind energy the highest? And you can see in Conejos County, March, April, May, every year, the wind energy peaks in that time. So let's make sure that we have cover out there during that year. There are climate quick reference guides for your area. You can type in your county and it will show you projected changes. These are models, but it's something we can start to think about to make more informed decisions so that we can, make decisions before and not have to be reactive. We know we're going to experience drought in this area. So what's our contingency plan? With a lot of our large livestock producers, we make sure that we work with them to have drought contingency plans. Well, what's your plan if there's a drought? Small pasture managers, do you have a plan on how you're going to get supplemental feed for your livestock in the event that your pasture just isn't going to be as productive as you need it to be? We also have pesticide screening tools so that we can evaluate what types of pesticides or chemicals, how they might potentially move and harm off-target organisms, because you don't want to plant a pollinator next to a field that you're just kind of nuking with pesticides that are going to impact bees if that's your goal. We have in-field soil health assessments, and these are all things that our field offices have been trained in, and they have an excellent foundation in how they can come out and assess your fields. And then as well as like ones that are specific to pasture too. So just wanted to mention that, in addition to those physical practices, I definitely encourage folks to, gather data and help use this data to make decisions. So with that, I was going to just say that cover crops and crop rotations are just two tools in the toolbox, really great tools, but to really build a system, you have to have that full systems approach. You have to have that soil health management system filled with all sorts of practices that can help you implement those 4 soil health principles and have redundancy. So just because you're implementing one practice that minimizes disturbance, let's look at how we can minimize it in every way possible. And maybe it looks like just adopting one practice and then expanding on that. Well, are we tilling a lot? Well, maybe let's start with going to reduced till. Let's take out 1 or 2 passes this year that maybe you don't need. And then as you understand and realize, oh, maybe my weeds actually weren't as bad as I thought with that tillage frequency. So maybe I'm ready to think about going no-till. Definitely start simple. But implement as many of those practices in your soil health management system that work for you. And you want to look at these practices as so minimizing disturbance and maximizing soil cover. They help really protect what you've built already. They're critical. It's that physical barrier over the soil. It's going to protect your soil aggregates that are out there, your organisms that are out there. It's going to help protect the soil organic matter that you already have out there. But you've also really got to incorporate those other two, because maximizing living roots and biodiversity of that system, that is what's regenerating. That's what's feeding that soil agroecosystem. It's going to fuel your soil biology. It's going to improve the resiliency of your system. And then it's going to build your soil organic matter. And then the other two are going to help protect it. So my last slide is just to talk about how NRCS can help. It's just 5 steps to assistance. Our practices, our planning works best if you give it time. We're a federal government program. Obviously, there's way too much paperwork and maybe sometimes hoops to jump through. We're working on improving that process, but it really helps us if you come in and meet with our field staff, get acquainted with them, have them out on your property so that we can make a plan and come up with a plan so that when it does come time to potentially look at financial assistance, you know, we've done the process that we're required to do through the planning. We already have that done. So then we can kind of go a little bit faster through the application process and establishing eligibility and ranking to hopefully implement that plan with some incentive payments. So I was just going to hope for maybe 10 minutes or so of discussion. And I can unshare my screen in case, or you can read me the questions in the chat if any have come in.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation, Christine. That was great. A lot of good information. So I'm probably going to ask you about a lot of things later on. But one of the questions that we have is, do you have any thoughts about cover crops in agroforestry and silviculture?
Hold on one second. Sorry, it was a snow day here and my kid just came upstairs. Can you say that again?
Yeah, any thoughts on agroforestry and incorporating cover crops into agroforestry and silviculture?
I went to school for forestry for my undergrad, but I have not, as far as I know, agroforestry out here, I'm not very familiar with those systems. We have some people who are growing cover crops in like an orchard situation. So in between our rows of, you know, apple trees, or on the western slope where they're doing grapes and peaches and stuff, they're definitely utilizing cover crops in between those rows rather than having them bare. And they're really specific. They're sticking with perennial cover crops typically too, ones that they can mow down and manage in the summer. So yeah, it just depends on the type of crops.
So just to follow up to that, can any plant be a cover crop? Since you mentioned, because I had this idea that a cover crop have to be like an annual or biennial. Can like perennial plants be considered a cover crop depending on the situation?
I would definitely think so. You know, anything that's covering a part of the land that was bare can be considered a cover crop. Now it gets a little trickier in annual systems because we've had producers come in and say, well, why isn't my corn a cover crop? You know, so we try to separate them for like cash crops versus cover crops, where we're planting the cover crop really to achieve like conservation benefits rather than to be part of the productive part. You know, we don't have any rules against harvesting cover crops, except we can't harvest cover crops for grain under our practices.
Okay.
So to answer your question, I think, yeah, any crop could be a cover crop. Sometimes cash crops are super expensive and perennials are more expensive than annuals for the most part. So we would only ever recommend a perennial if we have a window of time that would make sense for perennials.
Great. Thank you. We have couple other questions from Carl, and actually, if you want to unmute yourself, Carl, I think that would be a lot easier if you can do that. If not, I can just go ahead and read the questions. So one of the questions is thoughts on soil testing, and so I assume maybe the question here would be, when do you soil test for a cover crop, or do you need to have that before you plant a cover crop, or do you kind of go by after what happened? I mean, what happens after the cover crop to make sure that whatever you want to plant next is suitable for that situation?
Yeah, typically, we recommend annual soil testing. And it's less important for just doing it before the cover crop. You just want to be consistent each year on when you're taking the soil test so that you can, establish benchmarks and look at trends. And some things are dynamic, like especially if you're doing soil biology tests, things are going to be more active in the spring than they are, you don't want to soil test in the winter or whatnot. So with soil testing and that recommendation, we typically say before you're going to apply fertilizer, because the way we use soil tests mostly is for fertility. And so because the soil test can be dynamic and it's just a snapshot in time, be consistent each year and do it prior to when you're going to fertilize so that you know what's in your soil and you can kind of credit, nitrates or phosphates that might show up on the test, and put on less as a result of those tests.
Great. Another question is, any thoughts about cover crops and carbon storage?
Oh, yeah. I mean, anytime you're planting a plant, you are sequestering carbon. And anytime you're putting a plant out there instead of, tilling, you're helping to reduce greenhouse gases. So absolutely. Cover crop, like NRCS has this list of climate smart practices, which we have specific dollars that we're using just for practices that can quantifiably sequester carbon or reduce greenhouse gases, and cover crops is definitely one of those practices.
Nice. And I guess the last question was related to that. Just any thoughts on integrating cover crops and residue management? You mentioned tillage at some point. So do you have, I guess, any extra thoughts on that?
Yeah, we a lot of times do pair those practices together. In our residue management, it seems like it's more focused on the rotation and the amount of tillage that's out there. But when I talked about the, balancing that carbon to nitrogen ratio and making that system work for you,
Mm-hmm.
when you're thinking about cover crops, like I mentioned before, if you have a really high residue crop that you're going to plant a cover crop after, you can manage your residue a little bit better by planting a low residue crop. Maybe that together can kind of balance out the residue amounts that you have out there. Or putting more residue out there with a higher residue cover crop versus low residue cash crop. So we definitely usually pair those two together. And typically with cover crops, we're trying to reduce tillage passes because a lot of people use cover crops for just weed management, for putting out there, where people use tillage to manage weeds. It's a pretty common way of, getting rid of undesirable species that are growing out there. And so by using cover crops instead of tillage, you're kind of helping with the residue management twofold.
Great. Thank you. Just one quick question. For me, I guess, does NRCS support cover crops as a practice when you're transitioning to a perennial system?
Yeah, and that's a great question, Carla. We do. And in that situation, it seems like it's a little bit more of a nurse crop. So and that's allowed under the cover crop standard. So with NRCS, we have what our conservation practice standards kind of lay out what you can and can't do. And we use cover crops a lot of times to facilitate perennial seedings because perennial seedings just typically do better if there's cover out there. And so we might plant something like something a little bit simpler a lot of times that we know might win or kill, and then we'll kind of interseed a perennial mix in the spring into existing cover rather than just on bare ground, because that cover crop kind of helps nurse in and protect those newly established perennials that might be popping up. So the species mix might look a little bit different than if we were doing it in between annuals, but yep, we definitely use that to help facilitate those perennial seedings, and we recommend it too.
Great, thank you. Okay, I guess if we don't have any more questions, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who joined today.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and yeah, I just wanted to mention if everyone's paying attention to the chat, Cara put up a link about an upcoming webinar from NRCS. This is not hosted by me, but I think it'd be very interesting if you go to the chat and look at the webinar. It's called Getting the Most Out of Cover Crops. So it's also hosted by NRCS this month. So if you're interested in learning more about that topic, you can definitely sign up for that. And thanks again. If you have any more questions later on, feel free to send me an email. I will send out a notification when the recording is available on our website. So with that, thank you, Christine and Lisa. And
Yeah, thank you.
yeah. So have a good weekend, everyone. Stay warm.